Look at how nice these trees are. Considering the current environment, I figured that I would do the first lecture video on the second half of chapter 12. Chapter 12 is emotions, health, and stress. The last bit of the chapter has to do with coping and coping strategies and stress and all the things that I think are important enough to cover. First, even though stress is not an emotion, it generates very strong emotions, and prolonged stress can influence your health in a bad way, not a good way. It's not like being stressed out for a long period of time makes you healthier. We'd have a lot more healthy people that we don't. This is going to be a short video filled with what seems like common sense. I think the information's important enough that I'm going to make it public instead of unlisted on YouTube, because I think that the more people see this, the better, because what better time than now to figure out what stress is and what strategies are available to cope with it. What is coping? All these answers and more are available to you. That's right, you. In this upcoming video lecture. Get on it. As I mentioned earlier, stress itself is not an emotion, but it does provoke strong emotions, and it engages the same systems as emotions do. So, for instance, the endocrine system, with adrenaline and, fight or flight responses, as well as the autonomic nervous system, which is going to affect the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. All these things are affected with stress. And stress can have a detrimental effect on health, should it be prolonged. So in other words, short bursts of stress aren't that bad for you, but prolonged chronic exposure to stress, that can certainly wreak havoc on your body and leave you prone to illness. Hans Selye, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, noticed that a wide variety of illnesses produce the same symptoms, including the release of the hormone cortisol, which enhances metabolism and increases the supply of sugar and other fuels to the cells. That's me scratching my face. For Selye, stress is the nonspecific response of the body to any demand made upon it, and all demands on the body evoke a response that prepares us for fighting some kind of threat. More modern definitions consider stress an event or events that are interpreted as threatening to an individual and which elicit physiological and behavioral response. This more modern definition is good because it addresses individual differences in what is considered a threat or threatening. While the sight of a snake is threatening to most of us who live in an urban or suburban neighborhood, it's probably not as shocking or stressful or anxiety-inducing as it is to somebody who lives in more rural areas. The same thing with a criticism from your boss, or pretty much anything that causes stress to somebody else that doesn't cause stress to you, and vice versa. For instance, like going to the dentist, public speaking, parallel parking, etc., 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 etc. Selye described the general adaptation syndrome, which is the body's response to stressful events of any type. The alarm stage is marked by activity of the sympathetic nervous system to prepare the body for vigorous activity. Once again, the sympathetic nervous system is a branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is a branch of the peripheral nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system isn't meant for or capable of sustained or long-term arousal. So the alarm stage is meant to be short-lasting. During the resistance stage, adrenal glands continue to release cortisol and other hormones to maintain alertness, which eventually leads to the exhaustion stage, which is caused by prolonged stress. It's marked by fatigue, inactivity, and decreased ability to resist illness. Therein lies the danger. There are both direct and indirect effects of stress on health. Let's first go over the indirect effects. Indirect effects of stress on health, of prolonged stress specifically, are subtle behavior changes that might go unnoticed. For instance, you might sleep less, you might have worse sleep, you might lose your appetite, you might forget to take your medications, you might drink excessively or overeat. All these subtle behavior changes could start adding up, grains of sand. And those indirect effects could have an effect on your health, right? Of course. If you're not eating well, if you're not sleeping well, if you're not taking your meds, if you're drinking too much, if you're overeating, all those things are not going to lead towards the path of, wellness. Now that we've talked about the indirect effects, let's talk about the direct effects of stress. The direct effects of stress include a prolonged presence of cortisol and the damage it causes to our central nervous system and immune system. A moderate brief stressor is a good thing. It causes an increase in cortisol, which improves memory and attention, and activates the immune system to fight off infection. Prolonged exposure to cortisol, on the other hand, causes fatigue and eventually damage to the hippocampus, which is really important for memory. Eventually, the immune system weakens from overuse, and you become more vulnerable to illness. Considering that most people are, or should be, in a mode of staying healthy and avoiding illness, including yourselves, I hope, and considering that the indirect and direct effects of stress ultimately lead to a compromised immune system, which makes us more vulnerable to illness, it seems important to reduce stress. And that's done through coping strategies and or a natural resilience to distress. An example of how prolonged stress can directly affect health would be the correlation between heart disease and chronic anxiety. Further, heart disease can be influenced by social support, like strong friendships and family ties, with studies showing that people with strong friendships and family ties are more prone to take care of themselves, and therefore that's going to play into reduced blood pressure, and then over the long term, that reduced blood pressure being preventative to heart disease. And it can be managed by practicing techniques for reducing stress. So both social support, like having strong friendships and family ties, and relaxation techniques are both considered coping strategies for stress. So let's get into coping a little bit more. Richard Lazarus has a model of emotions that utilizes cognitive appraisals, and we're going to go a little deeper into it in a later lecture. But right now I'm going to introduce it because his model of emotions also accounts for stress. Put simply, when an event happens, there's an instinctive and reflexive appraisal about whether that event is threatening. Again, the appraisal is automatic, it's instinctive, it's reflexive, it's built into us. It's not like we decide is this threatening? It's not a conscious decision. It's an unconscious decision, potentially honed by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Since this appraisal is the first appraisal in the chain of events for Lazarus's model, it's called the primary appraisal, for good reason. If, after this primary appraisal, the event is not deemed a threat, there's no stress. But should the event be appraised as threatening, a second appraisal occurs and determines whether we have the ability to cope with it. If we can cope with it, it's deemed a positive stress, or like a challenge we can rise to. If it's appraised, on the other hand, that we cannot cope with it, it's a negative stress. It's the kind of stress that can, if prolonged, lead to the path of illness. So, what is coping? Coping with stress is the process of developing ways to get through difficult times. People cope with stress in many ways. They're generally grouped into three categories. There's the problem-focused coping, reappraisal, and emotion-focused coping. In many cases, the best way to handle stress is to do something about the problem. This, of course, would be problem-focused coping. Problem-focused coping is doing something to improve the stressful situation, right? This is actually exerting some kind of control over yourself or your environment. So, for example, if taking an exam stresses you out, then studying harder is a problem-focused method of coping. Hey, if I study harder, I'll get a better grade. The anxiety I have about taking an exam will come down a little bit because I'm studying even harder than I did last time. So that's one way of doing it. Events are generally less stressful when people think they can predict or control them. This might be naive. What I want you to do is think about controlling the environment, especially thinking about the current situation. Exerting control over your environment is going to be one of the things that might help you through a day, through a week, through the next couple of weeks. And what you can do is ritualize proper hygiene and complying with instructions from local health authorities and the CDC. That is, stay home and wash your hands. Maintain hygiene, a clean environment, and social distancing, while staying active and eating well to stay healthy. Story time. So me and my buddy Joe happens to be a amazing neuroscientist, talented guitar player, a Renaissance man. He and I have been having an ongoing joke over the past couple of days about coming up with a catchy, funky song about washing your hands. And we actually will sing into our phones and send those sound files to each other. I just wanted to let you know, A, that is a thing, B, that I have one of those sound files that I'm happy to share with you, okay? So, let's see if I can find this. Joe sending me this sound file. You're gonna love this, I promise. Here we go. And... that's the bass line. He's singing the bass line.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands.
Brush your teeth. Wash your hands and brush your teeth.
What does brushing your teeth have to do with it?
Wash your hands and brush your teeth and get that funk out of your junk.
Get that funk out of your junk. I am not responsible for the lyrical content of my buddy Joe.
Funk out of your junk.
I wanted to share that with you because it is the craziest thing. Oh, I love it. Also, if you find it confusing to know who to trust about what is going on, and that uncertainty is stressing you out, tune out the bad information. I'm talking social media, Facebook, Twitter, and focus on the most reliable sources available. I'm talking about the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, the World Health Organization, the WHO. The Johns Hopkins University website has aggregated data and represents everything on a map graphically. So if you're visually oriented, you can check that out. Any reliable information that you hear about, any reliable information that is being reported, any reliable information out there is going to be using these sources. So just use these three sources. You don't need other people to reinterpret information for you. Go to the source. Now it sounds like I'm yelling at you. I'm not yelling at you. Anyway, another coping strategy is reappraisal. Reappraisal is reinterpreting a situation to make it seem less threatening. Deciding that your grades are not very important, or if you get nervous before public speaking, if you embrace that nervousness before giving a speech as excitement for wanting to do a great job, that kind of reappraisal is going to reduce your actual stress because that arousing feeling is going to be reinterpreted, reappraised as something exciting. Interpreting a situation in a new, less threatening way reduces tension. Applied to the current situation, you could reappraise the time that you spend at home, assuming that you're viewing it negatively, which you may not be, but assuming that you're viewing your time home in a negative way, you could just reinterpret it. You could reappraise it to be a staycation where you get to declutter, maybe some early spring cleaning. If you hear anything in the background, my cat is going nutso crazy in the kitty litter right now. I don't know what we're feeding him to make him so nutso in the kitty litter, but he's a little nutso crazy in the kitty litter right now. Sorry about that. Keep it down, Hoku. Anyway. Self-improvement. Bust out some of those yoga DVDs that you didn't watch. Just change your perception of this time. Instead of it being like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to spend X amount of time at home. It could be, oh my God, I get to spend this amount of time at home. Same sentence, different emphasis. If you wanted to get even more abstract in your reappraisal, you could get into mindfulness meditation. And what you can do during this practice is just allow yourself to actually feel the stress. And instead of justifying why you're stressed or worrying about what it is that's making you stressed, or continuing any of the behaviors or thoughts that maintain these negative trappings of the stress, you can reinterpret the situation as an opportunity to focus on what stress feels like in your body. I know that seems like a weird goal, but I'll tell you what, what? It's like a superpower. As soon as you're able to focus your attention on what is happening with your body, like, oh, my heart rate has increased. I have this weird tingling sensation in my chest. Focus on those sensations, and it's almost impossible for you to fuse with the negative event that caused it. Of course, the more you do it, the better you get at it. The more you do any practice, the better you get at it. So utilize this superpower, mindfulness meditation. Just allow yourself to feel the stress, note what it does to your body, and then over time you will realize that just by observing it, you're going to actually mediate its effects. I recommend it highly. Meditation is also a technique that falls into another coping strategy category, emotion-focused coping. Emotion-focused coping is regulating one's emotional reaction. Emotion-focused strategies do not solve an underlying problem, but they help you manage your reaction to it. You could just push your emotions deep down, that's an option, and actively suppress them, but that's less than optimal for us in North America and Europe. But it does seem to work in some Asian cultures, so I guess it's not completely bad. I just don't recommend it. In addition to active suppression, you can also utilize social support, relaxation, exercise, and distraction to reduce excess anxiety. Social support. You need someone or a bunch of someones to talk to. Every once in a while, you can pick up this microcomputer that has a phone app and actually use the phone app. And in so doing, reach out to other people. Use your phone as a phone. Don't mean to be blowing your minds. That being said, there's been research to show that something as simple as holding hands with your significant other, right? It can reduce anxiety in the anticipation of receiving pain or something stressful. And the effect is strengthened even further if the relationship with you and your significant other is reported as highly satisfactory. So if you're in a very meaningful relationship, then the more time you're able to spend and get support with and support your significant other, the better the both of you will do in the face of this. Took care of the workout this morning. I woke up with my wife so that she didn't feel like she was doing this alone, because she is going to work for as long as possible. She works in the medical field, so she is needed. She's always needed, but she's needed at work. That's what I'm talking about. You can go back home, be productive, and shit. Relaxation. That is also a way that you can get through stressful situations. The mindfulness meditation that I was talking about with the reappraisal, that was more specifically for the mind, just changing your interpretation of things. Instead of it being you being a victim of something that is stress, it is you being an investigator of what this stress experience feels like. You're just reinterpreting the event. Meditation can also be used specifically for the purposes of relaxation. Through mental exercise and meditation training, it's been shown to increase reports of better health and less stress, improve the handling of stressful situations, increase compassion, and things like that. If you want a quick and easy way to increase relaxation, you can do something that's just called the body scan. Just take a moment, close your eyes, focus on your breath, and then just start at the top of your head and work your way down to the tips of your toes and just relax the muscles as this wave makes its way down your body. So you can just start at the top of your head, relax all of those muscles, work your way down to your shoulders, work your way down to your arms, your hands, your wrists, work your way down through your torso, to your hips, your legs, your knees, calves, ankles, and through your toes. If you have time, do that whole cycle again. Do it even more. The more you do it, the more relaxed you're going to get. The more moments of relaxation you have throughout the day, the more resilient you will be to upcoming stressful events. Just a suggestion. Exercise is considered a good way to reduce stress. It's been shown in studies that people who are active and healthy get stressed or react to stress less than average as compared to people who are less active. Exercise helps people relax. So, if relaxation is one of the ways to cope with stress and exercise helps people relax, then exercise is probably a pretty good idea. Interestingly, some of the effects of exercising are due to expectations. Here's another example where expectations shape perception. We are not in direct contact with reality because perception is malleable. Depending on how you think about your exercising, as you're doing your exercising, you will get more benefit out of it if you think about it as being beneficial. If you consider it as dull work, drudgery, something that's a task, as compared to something that you're doing to help yourself, to make yourself anti-fragile. If you think of your exercise in a positive way, instead of a negative way, you'll actually get more out of it. And then there's good old-fashioned distraction. Something over here is bothering you, focus on something over here instead. Nature is beautiful. Excuse me. So distraction is another emotion-focused coping strategy that is in part effective because of expectations, just like exercise. In a study using a cold pressor test where you hold your arm, hand, or fingers in ice-cold water that's maintained at a very specific temperature. You hold your hand in there until you can't stand the pain anymore, and then you pull it out. That amount of time is timed. And the longer you can hold your hand in the cold water, the longer you can withstand pain. By using this cold pressor test, we're able to determine what distractors are more effective in reducing pain than others. So there have been studies where people who are in the cold pressor test are in one of 3 different groups. In one of the groups, they just did the cold pressor test and listened to silence, but were told that they were listening to an ultrasonic sound that would help ease the pain of the cold pressor test. A second group was told to bring in music to listen to, and they listened to the music that they brought in while they did the cold pressor test. A third group was also told to bring music in to listen to while they did the cold pressor test, but they were told that listening to music itself reduces the pain. You have one condition where people are told that listening to nothing reduces the pain. You have another condition where they're listening to music but they're not told anything. And then a third condition where they're listening to music and told that the music is going to ease the pain in some way, shape, or form. And the results were that there was a little bit of efficacy with telling people, priming people that something that's not there is going to be easing the pain. And music all by itself has a little bit of an effect. But the 1-2 punch of listening to music and being told that the music itself is going to ease the pain seem to have the best results in increasing the amount of time that they can withstand pain and decreasing the amount of unpleasantness of the experience. Hoku, I thought I told you to chill out. Didn't you just do this a second ago? It's cats. Expectations shape perception. Perception is malleable. We are not in direct contact with reality. In addition to coping strategies, there seems to be a dispositional component that can handle stress better than others. I mean, some people seem to handle stress better naturally. We say they have resilience, an ability to handle difficult situations with a minimum of distress. You're a mess. And it seems that resilience is what we need right now in addition to coping strategies to help ourselves and others persist through difficult situations by finding meaning in life and maintaining an optimistic viewpoint. So with that, I hope you have a better understanding of what stress is, how to cope with stress, how bad stress can be, how valuable it is to have coping strategies for stress and reduce it. All of these things are good. And it is how we're going to be starting this video series of lectures. Stay tuned for more stuff. Alright, so I'm using a new mic because the last one I thought had a little bit of a hum to it, but this one has a little crackly weirdness going on. So if you detect that, then it's the mic. It's not me. Of all the weeks to be covering emotions, health, and stress of all the weeks. Emotions are pretty difficult to describe. It has been said that everybody knows what an emotion is until they're asked to define it. There is not an accepted theory of emotions. There are different perspectives, and we're going to be exploring those. Fun. We're going to begin our journey or adventure into emotions by first looking at how they're measured, because that gives us an idea of how they manifest through different systems. Right? We can measure it, we can observe it in some way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly. After that, we can take a look at the theories or perspectives about what emotions are after we understand them from the perspective of an observer. What do emotions look like? What do emotions feel like? How do they affect us in such a way that they can be measured? Let's begin there. Name that emotion. That's right. Come on and see if you can name the emotions being portrayed in these facial expressions. These photos are obviously outdated, but the emotions being expressed are not. Leave aside the black and white photos, sideburns, and we can likely name most of the emotions being expressed just by free recall without even being cued or guided. For instance, the blonde woman in the upper left photo is happy. The woman in the photo below her seems surprised. Either a dude's in the middle could be angry. Maybe the one on the bottom is disgusting. Mr. Sideburns in the upper right photo is sad. And that we can recognize any of these emotions in others reliably may play a role in their function. But that's for later. When measuring emotions, there are 4 categories of emotional reactions to measure. There are subjective experiences, or the feeling state of an emotion. There are the behaviors, like facial expressions or gestures. There are changes to the autonomic nervous system, as well as the central nervous system. So let's look at each of those. When we have an emotional experience, there's a subjective component that is phenomenological, it's experiential, it is something that only happens from our perspective, obviously because it's not happening to the people around us, and that is the feeling state of the emotional experience. Some of that feeling can be attributed to noticing changes in your body. Your heart rate is increasing, the sweat production is increasing as well, your breathing is changing, things like that. Another part of the feeling state of the emotional experience is purely psychological. We can explore this purely psychological part of it with self-reports. And these self-reports can either be like journals or essays or open-ended questions for qualitative data, or we can collect quantitative data by using scales or checklists. To be clear, qualitative data is non-numerical in nature and may include journaling or interviewing or literally expressing the quality of something like a smell or a taste. Whereas quantitative data collection is numerical in how the self-report data is collected. It is an endpoint of emotion that we can exclusively collect from human beings. Since we can't ask other animals how they're feeling, well, we can ask, we just won't get a meaningful response. We have to rely on observable, perceivable behaviors such as changes in voice, facial expressions, posture, gestures, and whole body. The way that emotions express themselves through voice changes is super easy to demonstrate. If I were to hold as a constant the word yes, and then just set it a bunch of different ways, you may or may not be able to detect exactly which emotion I'm doing each time, but you will notice a difference in the emotional tone between the examples that I'm about to give. To help, I'm going to black out the screen so you can't see the face that I'm making, and then afterwards I will unblack the screen, so that you can see the faces that go with each one. I'm holding the word yes as a constant and just changing the way that I say it to reflect how the voice can show different emotional states. Yes! Yes! Yes. 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 Yes! Yes! Yes. 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 From an anatomical and biomechanical perspective, these changes in voice quality are a logical consequence of different levels of arousal. When highly aroused, we are forcing air past our vocal cords at a faster rate than when we aren't. And this forcing of air past our vocal cords contributes to a more harsh quality or timbre to our voice. That we were able to differentiate some of the emotions from those super outdated black and white pictures from the 70s, that we were able to differentiate some of those emotions, even if not all of them, is a demonstration that there's at least a correlation, a very high correlation, between emotional states and facial expressions. And in order to make facial expressions, certain faces in the muscles need to be activated. And because of that, we can actually measure the activation of those muscles in the face, and there are many. And the amount that make up each facial expression are many, many, many. And what makes it even more difficult is, at any point in time, we're usually going through very quickly a cascade of emotions. So even though we're going to be talking about emotions as isolated things, potentially, we rarely experience them just as isolated things. There's a context, mood that we are in beforehand, and there might be a series of emotions that you go through. as you are processing what is going on in any particular event. If data is being recorded digitally, facial expressions can be coded on a frame-by-frame basis using atlases of the face. One of these atlases is the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS, developed by Paul Ekman, which tethers every facial expression to the movement of specific muscles of the face. These atlases can be used not only to code the facial expressions of others, but to train oneself on how to manipulate and control your own facial muscles to represent specific emotions. Additionally, because facial expressions are due to the activity of specific sets of facial muscles, this activity can be recorded by placing electrodes on the face and collecting data on which parts of the face are being activated. For instance, in general, your brow raises as a response to neutral or good stimuli, and lowers for negative stimuli. Think about what happens to a face when we are either surprised or happy. We raise our eyebrows. Now think about what happens to a face when we are angry or tasting something gross, disgusted. We lower our eyebrow. EMG recordings could detect the activation and intensity of the muscles responsible for either the raising or lowering of eyebrows. And along with EMG recordings from other areas and subjective ratings, it can help determine the existence and intensity of an emotional experience. Another set of behaviors that correlate with specific emotions and that we can observe and can be coded from video or photographic samples is how we hold ourselves when we stand, walk, or sit, our postures, and how we use or don't use gestures when we communicate. For the whole posture thing, I just want you to think about if you've ever been on public transportation or anywhere in public. Could be at a park and someone's sitting at a park bench. The difference between a dude who is laid out all over the place, almost too relaxed, as if they're in their own living room watching TV or something. That kind of body language, that kind of posturing is very different than somebody who has their elbows and knees locked together as they're riding public transportation or sitting on the park bench. Those postures both denote a difference in emotional tone. Let's move on to gestures. Imagine that you're observing two different conversations happening at two different tables at a restaurant between two people at each table. In the one, it's a lot of leaning forward on both parties. They're on opposite sides of the table. They're leaning in. There's some intimate touching. There's lots of smiling, lots of laughing, lots of looking directly into each other's eyes. And a couple tables down, there's a different couple of people that are sitting back from each other with their arms folded, both of them. You could tell that each of the people in the first table were in a different emotional state than the people at that second table. One of them being more positive, one of them being less positive, just by not only the facial expressions and the posturing, but also the gestures, the sitting back and the arms folded versus like the intimate reaching forward and touching. And then addressing whole body movements, we just have to think about how we walk. The difference in our walking behavior when we're in different emotional states. I'm going to use kind of an extreme example, so just bear with me here. So a couple walking out of a fertility clinic where they are told that the procedure is a success and they're going to be parents. The way that they walk out, the confidence, this, never mind the smiling and all that stuff, just the way their gait, the way they walk to the car with each other, the way they walk from the car to their front door with each other. That is going to be a different style of walking, a different way of presenting yourself, a different way of interacting spatio-temporally with the environment than if bad news was given. Just imagine a couple who got bad news after leaving a fertility clinic. The way that they would walk to their car, the way that they would walk from their car to their front door. There would be a marked difference in the way that they behave, just in the way that they walk that you can notice. As a reminder of the biological psychology lecture, our nervous system begins with our brain and our spinal cord. It's easy to remember them as your central nervous system because starting from the brain, your spinal cord runs down the center of your back. From the spinal cord, the nerves extend to receive and send information to the rest of the body, including the internal organs and glands of the endocrine system. Since these nerves extend from the center to the periphery, I'm hoping it'll be easy to remember that these nerves comprise the peripheral nervous system. But wait, there's more. The peripheral nervous system then branches into the autonomic and somatic nervous systems, with the autonomic nervous system literally meaning involuntary. So hopefully that will be easy to remember as the nervous system that controls the involuntary muscles like the heart, glands, and muscles, while the somatic nervous system controls the voluntary muscles. Somatic's root word is soma, which means body. Think back to when we were talking about the neuron, and the soma was the body of the cell to which the dendrite fed information and from which the axon extended. So the somatic nervous system controls the voluntary muscles of the body: arms, legs, fingers, toes, etc. We'll focus on the autonomic nervous system as it may yield some interesting data about how emotional states affect our involuntary responses. But we're not done yet. The autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which work together to maintain homeostasis in a complicated and not so straightforward way. But as a rule of thumb, the sympathetic prepares us for action, and the parasympathetic conserves energy and promotes maintenance of the body at rest. We will be focusing on the sympathetic branch of the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system and attempts to record data and measure changes from the cardiovascular, respiratory, endocrine, and excretory systems. Yes, I just said excretory. In the same way that we can use technology to apply electrodes to the face and detect muscle movement, we can also collect information about, among other things, how our heart and sweat glands are behaving, our current concentration of specific hormones, and the frequency and or depth of our breaths. By collecting this data, we can see how emotional experiences manifest in these systems, and further, see if there are noticeable differences between emotions on these endpoints. An emotional thumbprint of predictable sympathetic nervous system responses, if you will. And let's not forget about the boss of the nervous system, the brain. In addition to all the ways to measure emotions already talked about, self-report, behavior analysis, autonomic nervous system monitoring, we can also scan, image, and record brain behavior during an emotional experience. While an electroencephalogram, or EEG, measures electrical activity in certain specific areas of the cortex, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, uses an enormous magnet and physics I don't understand about the magnetic properties of oxygen-rich versus poor blood to detect blood flow in the brain. This has dominated imaging research since it doesn't require the ingestion or injection of anything. While any one of these ways to measure emotions provides its own insight into someone's emotional experience, the more that are used, the better. Each of these methods has limitations and downsides when used as a stand-alone measurement of emotion. For instance, we're horrible at interpreting why we feel how we feel. And further, there are social pressures preventing some people from being genuine and honest about how they feel. So self-report is quite limited in those ways. Analysis of behaviors by coding video recording frame by frame is time-consuming and prone to variance between coders. Further, while not being invasive, the electrodes used for EMG are cumbersome and difficult to adapt to for some. Autonomic nervous system data tells us mostly one variable of an emotional experience, arousal, or how intense the emotional experience is. This is not enough information to tell us which emotional experience it is. There are many emotional experiences that have a high arousal level. And lastly, imaging technology is complicated to clean up and interpret and relies on correlational as causation and does not lend itself to naturalistic settings. We did a study a few years ago where we were monitoring the heart rate of our participants as we were purposely trying to stress them out using a social stress test that I may have talked about in class. I think I did. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test. We were monitoring their heart rate in real time, and we could observe it because it was being displayed on a monitor that was right next to them, facing us as we were facing them. One of the reasons why it is important to collect more than one measure of emotions, like subjective as well as some kind of objective, like heart rate, is that whether or not people have a blind spot or are purposely being deceptive, they will sometimes rate themselves as not feeling anything in the presence of objective evidence that they are. For instance, I had a bunch of participants, not a bunch, few. While I was administering the stressor, the manipulation, I could see their heart rate going up, right? I could see it increasing. And before and after, we have them fill out a rating. How much stress are you experiencing right now? It started at not at all and ended at not at all. So let's review. The person is telling me they are not feeling any more stressed than they did at the beginning of the session, whereas their heart rate is still like 110 when during the baseline for that session, it was only like 70. That is the reason why it is important to collect more than one endpoint. Ooh, I'm scraping over some trees here. That way you can see what the difference is, if there is any, between the subjective versus objective measures that you collect. Now that we know what emotions look and sound like, we can begin to answer the question of what emotions are by at least saying that they have a social component to them. That is, it seems they are meant to communicate something about a current feeling state. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that both the subjective and objective changes we see in humans during an emotional experience are short-term and intense. Some would say this separates an emotion from something like a mood, which would by contrast be deemed long-term and minimally to moderately intense. But it's not that the two are unrelated. To help organize these ideas, some consider both emotions and moods, along with other things like feelings and aesthetic responses, depending on who you talk to, as being covered under the term affective responses. Affective responses can be defined as the general psychological state of an individual, including but not limited to emotions and mood within a given situation. But we are not here to talk about moods, feelings, or aesthetics. We're here to talk about emotions. Emotions! Now that we understand them from an observer's perspective, right? Not only things that we can observe with our own eyes, but we can also observe indirectly through machines. By the end of the next and final video, we will then understand them from a theoretical perspective, with a touch of history, because reasons. Until then, be well. For this final installment of Week 9, Chapter 12 on emotions, we're going to be covering 3 perspectives. Much of this next section is covered in a book by Randolph Cornelius, great name by the way, called The Science of Emotions. The 3 perspectives on emotions are the Darwinian Perspective, the Jamesian Perspective, and the Cognitive Perspective. And important to be maintained while learning about these perspectives is that they are not mutually exclusive or incompatible. I'll be relying on a narrative that views each of these perspectives as building on the last one, which will also allow me to sneak in some history of psychology, which I know you're all super excited about. You're welcome. The Darwinian perspective views emotions as evolved phenomena with important survival functions that have been selected for because they have solved certain problems we have faced as a species. The Jamesian perspective can be best summarized by William James himself. Bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. Sorry, I had to do my old-timey voice. And finally, the cognitive perspective views all emotions as being dependent on what researcher Magda Arnold called appraisals, the process by which events in the environment are judged as good or bad for us. Let's jump into these different perspectives. The Darwinian perspective. Thinking about emotion in no way began with Charles Darwin. It had been covered by ancient philosophers, adored by writers and painters of Romanticism, and observed and experienced by every human ever, in every culture ever. Fact. But we will, for the purposes of this class, start with Darwin to begin an outline of modern emotion theories to explain where we are currently and why. Since scientific camps are built around supporting or opposing the popular theories of their times, it's important to go through a little bit of history to see why we are where we are. In 1872, Darwin published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he, not surprisingly and as the title forecast, described the facial expressions and bodily movements that accompany several emotions in humans and other animals. Darwin's theory of evolution inspired research that compared behaviors across species, known as comparative psychology. This boon in comparative psychology was in part, if not whole, due to the view of humans as just another animal. And this allows us to predict that behaviors and experiences that we have as humans may exist in other species with which we share a common ancestor. Noticing the similarities between human and non-human animal emotional behaviors, Darwin concluded that emotions are derived from our animal precursors and have similar values and expressions. That value is survival. The Darwinian take understands emotional expressions in terms of their functions and hence survival value. Having connected humans to animals and animals to survival value, it's no surprise that Darwin saw emotional expressions like facial expressions to represent a set of fundamental, basic, or primary emotions which represent survival-related patterns of responses to events in the world that have been selected for over the course of our evolutionary history. This is easy to demonstrate with an emotion like disgust. The facial expression for disgust, which exists in newborns and blind newborns, is the face of someone trying to get something out of their nose or mouth. The nostrils scrunch up to prevent more toxic air from coming in and contaminating us. We frown as we protrude our tongue to remove noxious stimuli from our mouth hole. This serves an obvious survival function, as bitter can signal poisonous, toxic, noxious sources. The work of the Darwinian perspective has been taken up by Paul Ekman, Mr. Sideburns guy from that first photo and the guy who assembled the facial action coding system, or FACS. Ekman came into facial expressions through an interest in nonverbal communication and attempting to solve how difficult that was to measure. Inspired by Darwin and an anthropologist named Margaret Mead, and pushed by his mentor Sylvan Tompkins, Ekman decided to focus on facial expressions. After some studies showing consistencies between Eastern and Western literate societies in applying emotion labels to facial expressions, very same thing that we did at the beginning of the last video, he extended his research to the pre-literate society of Papua New Guinea. If he could demonstrate that a pre-literate society, devoid of all the cultural trappings and history of a first-world literate society, were also consistent in applying emotional labels to facial expressions, he had a leg to stand on to say that the emotions represented by these facial expressions, with the most agreement between cultures, were fundamental, basic, and primary. Ekman succeeded and went a step further and took pictures of the New Guinea tribesmen as they made facial expressions that represent specific emotions and brought these photos back to the United States and had students apply emotional labels to them with similar success as the tribesmen. The Jamesian Perspective. 12 years after Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, William James published the article, What is an Emotion? In the journal Mind. Unlike Darwin, who was describing emotional expression, James was interested in describing emotional experience. Bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. I love the fact that I get to do that more than once. Okay, follow this logic with me. First, there is an exciting fact. Then, a perception of that exciting fact, directed followed by bodily changes. Then we feel these bodily changes, and that is the emotion. This flips on its head the received wisdom or common sense notion that we cry because we are sad. Oh, no, James may say. That would imply that the crying happened after there was an emotion of sadness. The bodily response of crying actually happens reflexively, and upon realizing that you are crying, you then and only then feel sadness. In James's own words, in my old-timey voice, we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble. Even though crying, striking, and trembling are three very, very different bodily responses. We'll be charitable and take home the point that for James, and also Dutch physiologist Carl Lang, our body responds first, and our experience of these changes constitutes what we call an emotion. But there are some problems here. One, there's no clarification of what the perception is that triggers the bodily changes in the Jamesian model. Two, with the advent and refinement of equipment that could record autonomic nervous system function, some of the theoretical Jamesian claims don't hold up in the lab. Let's save the first and address the second. Walter Cannon and Philip Bard challenged the Jamesian perspective by doubting the contribution and role of the viscera, or internal organs, in emotion. To explore this, they severed the pathway for receiving information from the viscera in cats. They found that the cuter the cat, the more difficult it was to do the surgery. Nope. Kidding. They actually found several things of interest. 1. Total separation of viscera from the central nervous system does not alter emotional behavior. 2. Visceral changes are too slow to be a source of emotional feeling. So much for bodily changes occurring first. 3. The same visceral changes occur in very different emotional states, and non-emotional states as well. Without specificity, or that thumbprint of the autonomic nervous system activity for each basic emotion, we're just talking about arousal. And that's not enough information to infer an emotion. Instead of placing the focus of emotion experience into the things that the autonomic nervous system controls, Cannon and Bard placed it on the thalamus, which is a part of the brain that sensory information from all over the body converges and is then sent out to other areas in the cortex from. So, for Cannon and Bard, the bodily changes and the emotion experience occur simultaneously because they are both controlled by the thalamus. Schacter and Singer. Imagine you are a participant in a study. At the beginning of the study, you are injected with what you are told is a new drug, suproxen, for an eyesight test. You go into a room with another participant and begin the session. Over time, the other participant begins to get agitated and begins acting more and more angrily. Over the same period of time, you notice your heart rate increase and your palms are getting sweaty, and you interpret this as yourself becoming angry. The injection of suproxen is actually epinephrine, and you are being artificially aroused. In this state, you are placed in a room with someone you think is another participant, but it's actually a confederate or a paid member of the research team whose job it is to either act in a positive or negative way, as the effects of epinephrine start kicking in you. Not surprisingly, people who were in the room with the confederate acting negatively interpreted their arousal as anger more so than those in the room with the confederate acting positive. While there were other groups in the study, this is generally used as evidence for the idea that there needs to be another factor along with this arousal to get an emotion. And for Schacter and Singer, that other factor is what they called a cognitive label. We identify an emotion on the basis of how we perceive the situation. A pounding heart and sweating doesn't mean anything if it doesn't have a cognitive label determining whether it is a good surprise like happiness or a bad surprise like anger or fear. Schacter and Singer's theory is referred to as the two-factor theory because, in addition to arousal, they include cognitive label as a factor that determines what emotion is experienced. At around the same time as Schacter and Singer were introducing the factor of cognitive label, Magda Arnold had taken the role of cognition one step further in her conception of appraisals. First, what is an appraisal? An appraisal is a process by which events in the environment are deemed good or bad by us. It is unconscious, reflexive, and instinctive interpretation. Second, so what? Well, she took it from something that happened alongside a bodily reaction, as Schacter and Singer were proposing, and promoted it as the very filter through which all behaviors and responses are determined. Her explanation is so clever. It brings us back to the Jamesian perspective. Remember, James explained emotions as such. Haha, old-timey voice. Bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. I think that last part's my favorite. First, there is an exciting fact. Then, a perception of that exciting fact, followed by bodily changes. When we feel these bodily changes, that is the emotion. But he doesn't go deep into what that perception is that triggers the bodily changes, or how it takes place. For Arnold, that void is filled with appraisal. From this model, thought and emotion are inseparable, which rubs against a popular notion that getting more emotional means getting less reasonable or less rational or thoughtful, and that there is an eternal battle between our passions and our rationality. While appraisals are automatic thoughts that guide emotion experience, they are thoughts nonetheless. And while other appraisal theorists configure the role and place of appraisals differently, they all agree on how important appraisals are in guiding emotions and emotional responses. One appraisal theorist that is of note works right here at Rutgers Camden, and that is Dr. Ira Roseman. Dr. Ira Roseman taught a course on emotions when I was a student here 20 years ago. He has a sophisticated theory of appraisals and emotions that I think is worth looking at, but I'll only do it briefly here just so you have an idea of what an appraisal theory actually looks like. Dr. Roseman uses a 5 appraisal dimension model in that he lists 5 different appraisals as necessary for determining an emotion. Those appraisals are agency, who is responsible or what is responsible, probability, power, situational state, and motivational state. If I use the appraisals of motive consistent or positive, circumstance caused, with an uncertain probability, it would land me on the emotion of hope. Hope turns to surprise if I change one appraisal from uncertain to unknown, but turns to fear if I change the situational state from motive consistent to motive inconsistent. Using Dr. Roseman's model as an example for appraisal theories of emotion, we can see how complex these models can get. Staying within the cognitivist perspective, but moving on from Roseman, we are introduced to Magda Arnold's true heir, Richard Lazarus. Lazarus's cognitive model of emotion can be easily illustrated as placing the appraisal before the feeling or bodily changes. He can use this simplified model to contrast cognitive theories to other theories of emotions. And his model can be expanded to include his theory of coping with stress, in which he employs two forms of appraisal. Primary appraisal determines whether the stressor is a challenge or threat, and if deemed a threat, it is appraised a second time to determine potential options and how effective they would be. That would be the coping component. If we take the Darwinian perspective that emotional expressions and behaviors are or were useful to survival at some point in our evolutionary past, and add to that the Jamesian perspective that our autonomic nervous system response is also a consequence of survival readiness, and the cognitive perspective that all of these responses are controlled by reflexive and fundamental cognitive appraisal, we can see how each theory can fit neatly into each other. But back here on Earth, in reality, where things aren't quite so tidy and linear, there are Jamesians and cognitivists that are duking it out in the academic arena by publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and I'm sure conventions on emotions get quite heated, but for the purpose of this class, I'd like you to understand the narrative I've presented and how each perspective has contributed to our current understanding of emotions. Now that we have a feel for some different theories of emotions, let's take a step back and revisit some of the points brought up that help us understand some ongoing discussions in emotion research. For instance, earlier in this video I said, having connected humans to animals and animals to survival value, it's no surprise that Darwin saw emotional expressions in facial expressions to represent a set of fundamental, basic, or primary emotions which represent survival-related patterns of responses to events in the world that have been selected for over the course of our evolutionary history. The idea that there is a set of basic emotions has been subsumed under what is called the Discrete emotions perspective. The perspective contends that each emotion, for example, anger, sadness, contempt, corresponds to a unique profile in experience, physiology, and behavior. That is, the emotions are discrete and unique from each other in the same way a thumbprint and iris scanner depends on the uniqueness of these attributes between individuals. The basic or garden variety emotions, often included in lists of such things, are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. It is from these basic emotions, according to discrete emotions theorists, that other, more complex emotions are derived. To decide what is a basic emotion, psychologists have proposed the following criteria. Basic emotions should emerge early in life without requiring much experience. Basic emotions should be similar across cultures. Otherwise, enculturation, or learning the norms of a culture, could be pointed to as a contaminating or confounding variable. Each basic emotion should have a distinct physiology. Each basic emotion should have its own facial expression. The bodily and behavioral changes we see should be in line and congruent with serving the purpose of that emotion's role for survival. That is, it is congruent with anger and fear to have a highly aroused state, whereas it is incongruent with sadness. In the same sense, it would also be incongruent with sadness to have a furrowed brow and wrinkled nose. But for the reasons described earlier, these behaviors are completely congruent with disgust, without distinct physiology and facial expressions. It would be difficult to justify the claim that emotions are pragmatic and our reactions are or were needed at some point in our evolutionary history to prepare us for events in the environment that maximize survival. But there are problems with relying too heavily on facial expressions as an indicator of basic emotions. First, we seldom recognize an emotion from facial expressions alone. We identify someone's emotion by context, posture, touch, tone of voice, and gestures, and not just by facial expression. Second, in everyday life, most expressions show a mixture of emotions. If we take photographs of spontaneous, everyday expressions, observers often disagree with one another. They see more than one emotion in each face, and what they see doesn't always agree with what the person in the photograph was actually experiencing. Third, the ability of people to recognize expressions of joy, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise cannot tell us whether people have precisely 6 basic emotions. We can also identify additional states, such as contempt and pride. So if the ability to identify an expression is evidence for a basic emotion, our list of basic emotions should grow. Finally, the fact that we recognize expressions of disgust and surprise is not decisive for calling them emotions, because we can also recognize expressions of, say, sleepiness and confusion, which most people do not regard as emotions. And discrete emotions theorists like Paul Ekman would get around these critiques by pointing out the differences between moods and emotions, and by pointing out that emotions are both universal and culture specific. They are universal in that they are seen cross-culturally, but they are culture specific in that the cause and expression of emotions is shaped by the cultural environment. This shaping of when and how to express emotions, Ekman calls display rules, and these rules change between cultures to influence the expression of the universal and basic emotions. An alternative to the discrete emotions perspective is the dimensional perspective, which strives to discover the underlying dimensions that organize emotional states. For instance, arousal. Some emotions, like sadness, are low arousal, while others, like happiness, are high arousal. Valence, or whether something is positive or negative, is another dimension of interest because high arousal could mean more than one thing. Surprise, which kind of has no valence, anger or fear, which has a negative valence, elation or happiness, which has a positive valence. In order to provide more information to an emotional event, arousal states need to at least be labeled as positive or negative. Using arousal and valence as emotional dimensions should sound familiar. They are the two factors in the two-factor theory of Schacter and Singer. They would fall under the dimension emotions perspective. Beyond the two dimensions, approach and avoidance is often used in some form on dimension models of emotions. Think back to the model of Dr. Ira Roseman. His is a dimensional model that has arousal labeled as power, valence labeled as situational state, and approach avoidance labeled as motivational state. In addition to those appraisal dimensions, he includes probability, and agency. And as we saw earlier, different emotions are the resultant of different appraisal combinations, and changing almost any appraisal dimension will change the resultant emotion. Emotions must be useful for something, or we would not have evolved the capacity to feel them. One function is that emotions focus our attention on important information. Your eyes and your attention turn at once towards images that evoke strong emotions, even if you're trying to pay attention to something else. Emotions or moods also adjust our priorities. If you're running away from a mad attacker with a chainsaw, you don't stop to smell the roses. When you're in a happy mood, you expand your focus. According to Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build hypothesis of positive emotion, a happy mood increases your readiness to explore new ideas and opportunities. You think creatively, notice the details in the background that you ordinarily overlook, and increase your pursuit of new experiences that'll help maintain your happy mood. Here's something to noodle. Although major depression impairs reasoning, a mildly sad mood aids reasoning under some conditions. It appears sad people tend to be less optimistic, and therefore more realistic, and sad people generally examine the evidence more cautiously than average before making a decision. When people make moral decisions, they often make a quick, emotional decision and then look for an explanation afterward. The emotional guidance usually works. Your emotional reaction is a quick guide to making a decision that is almost always right. In philosophy, there's a thought experiment that helps thinking about moral decisions, called the trolley dilemma. In short, a trolley is careening out of control and heading towards 5 people stuck on the tracks. You could flip a switch and divert the train towards a track where only one person is stuck. Should you do it? You'd be sacrificing one life for the lives of 5. Here's a twist called the footbridge dilemma. In short, a trolley is careening out of control and is heading towards 5 people stuck on the tracks. This time, you're standing on a footbridge over the trolley tracks with a large individual leaning over the ledge to watch the scene. You could push the individual over the ledge and onto the tracks and prevent the train from striking the 5 people stuck on the tracks. Should you do it? You'd be sacrificing one large life for the lives of 5, same as above. Or is it? As uncomfortable as it is, more people are willing to flip a switch which provides emotional distance than physically pushing another human to their death to solve the same problem. The personal element of making physical contact with a person makes the footbridge option more emotionally repulsive, even if it is pragmatically equivalent. Further, after people make moral decisions in cases like these, they often have trouble stating a reason for their decision. We make quick, emotional decisions and then look for an explanation afterwards. We are predictably irrational. As evidence of the role of emotions in moral decisions, we have research done on patients with brain damage. Story time. In 1848, Phineas Gage was working on the railroad literally, and while tamping down some dirt in a hole above a layer of blasting powder, his attention was diverted and his hammer came down a little too hard on the iron rod he was using to tamp down the dirt, and the blasting powder exploded, driving the iron rod through Phineas Gage's head, in through the left cheek and out through the top of the head above the left eye. Gage survived, but the accident left him with damage to his prefrontal cortex. Over time, people noticed that he often showed little emotion and made poor impulsive decisions. Since it is unethical to remove or damage parts of the human brain to see what is being affected, cases like Phineas Gage show how naturally occurring events, as well as traumatic accidents, can provide a sample of people with brain damage to study. And neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio are leading the charge on studying these cases to piece together correlations of damage and behavior change that can provide insight into the mind-body connection. Damasio has studied many cases of brain damage, some similar to Phineas Gage, in that the same area of the prefrontal cortex is damaged. What he found is, as a rule, people with damage to this specific part of the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to be precise, have trouble making decisions and seem particularly impaired in what we consider normal moral judgments. When presented with the trolley car dilemma, they will opt for the one person to die over 5, which is fine. But even if that one person were their mother or their daughter, this minor alteration usually changed the answers of people without damage. Of course we don't want our mother or child to die. It is morally equivalent to those with impaired emotions, though. That is, people with damage to the prefrontal cortex cannot imagine feeling good or bad after various outcomes. Therefore, they do not consider the emotional pain that a decision might cause. Emotional intelligence. From the lecture on intelligence, you may remember the multiple intelligences theory of Howard Gardner, which posits that there are many different intelligences instead of a general intelligence. While Gardner speaks about inter- and intrapersonal intelligence, and even existential and naturalistic intelligence, he doesn't address emotional intelligence. But even casual observations in everyday life suggest that reasoning about emotional topics is different from reasoning about anything else. Some people just know the right thing to say to make someone else feel better. They notice subtle signals in people's facial expressions that indicate who needs reassurance or a pat on the back. They know when a smile is sincere or fake. And other people, smart in their own way, seem clueless in emotional situations. Psychologists therefore speak of emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, imagine, and understand emotions, and to use that information in making decisions. However, emotional intelligence is a useful concept only if it predicts such outcomes better than we already could with other tests. Emotional intelligence scores correlate significantly with overall intelligence and with conscientiousness and other personality factors. So in other words, we can predict people's friendships, happiness, and life satisfaction moderately well from tests of academic intelligence and personality factors. But it's not clear that current measurements of emotional intelligence predict much that we could not already get from these academic intelligence tests and certain aspects of personality. Okay, that wraps up this final installment of Week 9, Chapter 12, Emotions. I'm sorry it's not as well produced as the other two. These things take a ton of time, and I'm trying to find a way to streamline how I get these things done. So I will talk to all of you through email next week. Be on the lookout for at-home quizzes to open up on Sakai. All right, bye.